Okay, thanks very much for joining me, and I want to thank the good people of Adelaide for the welcome I've had over the last couple of days. I was in Norwood yesterday talking to people about the referendum on October 14, and this morning, after I appeared on 5AA, I took a walk through Rundle Street Mall and walked here, talking with people again about the issue of the constitutional change that we are putting forward for the Australian people, and why we will be an even better country on October 15 if Australians take the opportunity to vote yes to recognise First Nations people in our Constitution, but also to give them an advisory committee so that we can get better outcomes, better efficiencies, avoid the waste that's occurred for too long with money not going to the right places to make a real difference on education and health and housing and life expectancy in the other areas where there remains a significant gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. I want to say as well that I announce today that on Monday I'll be bringing the entire federal cabinet to Adelaide for a meeting on Monday afternoon. I'll be visiting Whyalla on Monday morning with the Premier of South Australia, Peter Malinauskas, and I want to bring the whole cabinet here, as I have been doing around the country. I want to make sure that my cabinet understands that everything doesn't happen in Canberra, that we need to get out there and about, and that's been something that has characterised my government, engaging with people in local communities, and Premier Malinauskas will address our cabinet as well about issues surrounding South Australia, and I am really enjoying the positive partnership that I have enjoyed with Peter Malinauskas and the South Australian government going forward. Today we have an announcement of the COVID inquiry. That is important that it take place. We said before the election, and I've said since, given the enormous dislocation, the stress, the, of course, loss of life, the economic impact of the pandemic, it is appropriate that when we reached a certain period that we would have an inquiry. It's a commitment I made before the election, and one of the things that we've been doing is ticking off all those commitments that we have made. Yesterday, 5.5 million Australians enjoyed an increase to their payments. We, for the first time, an additional 65,000 single mums got access to the single parenting payment. Making these changes are making a difference. We are making sure that we deal with cost of living pressures. But of course, Australians will recall, will never forget what the country went through in 2020 and 2021 in particular. It was a time where Australians joined together. They made sacrifices to help each other. They sacrificed some of the normal activity that would go on, and it was a very disruptive period in our lives, but we got through it, and we got through it in a way that was positive in most respects, but we need to examine what went right, what could be done better with a focus on the future, because the health experts and the science tells us that this pandemic may well be, indeed is not likely to be, the last one that occurs. So that's why better preparedness is very important. So the inquiry that we're announcing today will look at as well the more than 20 inquiries that have already happened by people like Dr Peter Shergold and the other inquiries that have occurred across states and territories and the Commonwealth up to now. Bring them all together in a consolidated way, but also look at new information which will occur. One of the things that I want to do from the lessons as well is to ensure that we're positive, that the process of learning from the pandemic is constructive rather than destructive. One of the things that didn't help during the pandemic was the sort of activity like when the federal government supported Clive Palmer's legal case rather than supported Mark McGowan and the actions that the WA government were taking. but we need to make sure that this is forward-focused and consider all of the Commonwealth responses to the pandemic. The terms of reference for the inquiry include key health measures, including COVID-19 vaccinations and treatments, key medical supplies such as personal protective equipment and public health messaging, broader health supports for those impacted by COVID-19 and lockdowns, including mental health and suicide prevention supports, and access to screening and other preventative health measures, financial support for individuals, the support for industry and business, assistance for Australians abroad, including assisted return to Australia, and governance and national governance mechanisms, including the National Cabinet and the way that it functioned, and the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee. An independent panel has been appointed to conduct the inquiry, and I'm very pleased, and I want to thank the 3 individuals who've agreed to be part of this inquiry. They have vast experience in public health, in government and economic expertise, and Minister Butler will go through some of the credentials which are there. The panel members are Ms Robin Cruck, AO, an outstanding public servant, a former head of departments including health in New South Wales, federal departments, someone who has great expertise at both the Commonwealth and the state level of the way that the public sector and the public service operates. Professor Catherine Bennett, an epidemiologist, an expert who will bring in that health expertise, and Dr Angela Jackson, someone who has an expertise in economics, someone well credentialed to be able to provide input to that. The panel will consult widely and will invite submissions from members of the public. They'll be supported by a task force within my department, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, so that you have a whole-of-government response to provide research and administration assistance. And we're asking that the inquiry report back within a year. If they can do it sooner, all the better, but we're giving a 12-month time frame for that to occur. We want to make sure that its recommendations are fully understood and that we prepare. We know a lot of what we need to do as a result of the pandemic. One of the things that I've stressed is we need greater economic resilience. We need a future made here in Australia. We're vulnerable for shocks like a pandemic, and there could be other shocks as well where some of these recommendations could be relevant, be they the issue of cybersecurity or the issue of international conflict as well. We need a future made in Australia. We need to be more resilient. We need to be more prepared for this in the future, and that's precisely what this inquiry will be aimed at. Minister.
Well, thank you, Prime Minister. As the Prime Minister said, before the election we promised that there would be a deep and thorough inquiry into the nation's pandemic response. It would be extraordinary not to, given the depth of impact that this pandemic has had on our country over the last 4 years. We also said, though, that the response would take place after the worst period of the pandemic had receded, and we wouldn't start an inquiry while our health systems, our governments were still focused on pandemic management. While COVID is no doubt still with us, the impact of COVID right now on the community, on our health system, is at its lowest really through the whole 3.5 years. Certainly the lowest on our health system since Omicron emerged about 22 months ago. So we are certain that now is the time to start this inquiry. As the Prime Minister said, this will be a thorough inquiry. The panel will have 12 months to consider all of the elements set out in the terms of reference, which have now been published on the Prime Minister and Cabinet Department website. The 3 members of the panel that the Prime Minister has already named have a very broad range of experience, skills and expertise that will allow us to deal with the very diverse range of issues that that confronted us through this pandemic. As the Prime Minister said, Robin Kruk AO is one of the country's leading public servants. She has run the New South Wales Department of Health, one of the biggest health systems in the Southern Hemisphere, as well as a federal department, and was the inaugural CEO of the National Mental Health Commission when that body was established more than a decade ago. She is really an outstanding public servant, respected right across the political spectrum at state and federal level. She will be supported with the epidemiological expertise of Professor Catherine Bennett, who holds the chair in epidemiology at Deakin University and will be a face very familiar to members of the Australian community as a very regular and trusted commentator on the pandemic right through the last 3.5 years, explaining the intricacies of this virus to Australian members, often at a period where the community was understandably very, very frightened. So she will be a wonderful addition to this panel. And as the Prime Minister said, Dr Angela Jackson is a very widely renowned economist with a particular focus on health economics, which will allow her to bring that important economic frame to the inquiry as well. The inquiry will be encouraged to engage with all stakeholders and members of the public very broadly right across the country to think about this response in its broadest and deepest sense. Now, unquestionably, is the time to learn the lessons of our response to this pandemic, learn what we did well and make sure we build that into the response of future pandemics, but also what we could have done better, and make sure that when the next pandemic strikes, which it will, according to all of the health advice, that we do better in those areas. Importantly as well, this will help us build the Centre for Disease Control, the CDC, that the Prime Minister promised before we were elected last year, as an important part of the infrastructure for our pandemic preparedness and response. This will be a very, very important part of our preparedness for the next pandemic. Happy to take questions.
Can you, will the appearances be voluntary, or will the inquiry ask people to attend, especially state leaders?
Well, I should imagine that everyone will want to participate in this. This isn't. I've seen some of the commentary this morning that I find pretty extraordinary, although consistent, I guess, with the way that they operate, that the Coalition have criticised this before they've seen the terms of reference. The Coalition are addicted to saying no to everything, and that's why I think the Coalition of yesterday have been turned into the no-alition of today. This should not be a source of conflict. This should be a coming together in a constructive way to learn the lessons which have been done from the pandemic, and that is the spirit in which it's operating. This is an independent panel. They'll decide the process in detail, but there will be submissions and input from stakeholders as well as from individuals.
But given it's not a royal commission, can state leaders be compelled to give evidence, or could they say no?
Well, the idea that this at starting point is how can we force someone to do something? How can we get conflict? Is completely contrary. It's completely contrary to the spirit. Well, which state leaders? Premier Marshall was the leader here in South Australia. There's been a change of government. Well, there's been a change of government in 2 of the states, and at the time of the pandemic, there were 3 Liberal premiers in states and 3 Labor premiers. This should not be a source of conflict. Part of the lesson of the pandemic is that Australians need to work together. Australians did work together at the community level, at the household level, at the neighbourhood level. And the idea that this should be subject to political bickering is not what the objective is here. That's old. That's old politics. Well, which state leaders? Which state leaders? Well, the others. Marshall. Look, this is not.
Andrews is still in the job. Can he say no if he is asked to give evidence?
Well, why do you say Dan Andrews? There are 6.
Because you pointed out that there's been a change.
There are 6. Well, there's been a change of premier in WA. There's been the change of Premier in Tasmania as well. There's been a range of changes being made. This isn't aimed at conflict. This is aimed at people being able to participate. And I raised this at the National Cabinet, and all of the Premiers and Chief Ministers welcomed this approach of a constructive way of looking forward. There have been 20 inquiries already, and what it's aimed at is looking forward for how we get better preparedness in the future.
Why not the Royal Commission?
Because I promised one Royal Commission as leader of the Labor Party. That was into robo-debt, and that has reported and has been effective. One of the things we've learned about Royal Commissions is that they can roll on and on and on for year after year after year. We've learnt that with the Royal Commission into veterans issues has been extended. We are still having a Royal Commission into the treatment and disabilities issues that has been going for some period of time. There have been 20 inquiries already. What we want to do is to bring together that information and to consolidate that. What are the findings of the inquiries that have been held? There's been a commission, for example, already in my state of New South Wales into the Ruby Princess. There's been a range of inquiries. What we want to do is to get the information consolidated and get those recommendations about how we better prepare in the future.
But why the Royal Commission happened reasonably swiftly?
Hang on, one at a time.
Why the rush to get it done within a year, then, if there has, especially if there has already been 20 inquiries? Wouldn't a Royal Commission get down to the bottom of it once and for all?
No one promised a Royal Commission. I see the attempt by the coalition to somehow say that that's the case, and I find it extraordinary, but completely consistent. Before legislation is introduced, quite often the coalition will come out and say they're against it. They vote against everything. Now they're saying they're against this before they've even seen the terms of reference. I find that extraordinary. Well, what do you think a Royal Commission could do that this couldn't do? Nothing. This will be an inquiry that will hear from stakeholders, that will get input, that will report within a year, because a lot of the work has already been done. There have been 20 different inquiries.
Wouldn't the concern be that if an inquiry will only give us select information, whereas a Royal Commission would allow us to compel past leaders and current leaders to give us all the information that we need?
Well, a Royal Commission is usually presided over by a judge or someone with a legal background. What we have here is an inquiry that is led by a leading public servant who understands the way that the public sector works at Commonwealth and state level, a leading health expert, Professor Bennett, and a leading health economist in Dr. Jackson. That's the information that we need going forward. And Australians need to look forward on this. There are a range of opinions, and certainly I find the coalition's argument that we don't want to concentrate on the issues of the former government. I'm not quite sure what people think the incentive is for a new government, like the one I lead, to not go back. But we're determined to actually make sure, and that's why we have an inquiry led by 3 appropriate people, and that is the form that we've established. Sure.
You said that Royal Commissions can go on for years, but the robo-debt commission that you pointed out was a swift one. Is there a reason why that process couldn't be?
Well, I'm not quite sure why we are doing exactly what the inquiry. I just pointed out that Royal Commissions are usually led by judges or former judges. They look at things in a particular way. What we want to look at is what are the economic impacts. That's why we have an economic impact expert. What are the health impacts? So we have a health expert. And what are the governance issues? and the issues both Commonwealth and state. And this is a positive move going forward. This is perfectly consistent with what governments like Singapore have done to look forward.
So will border closures and the length of lockdowns be looked at?
Well, they can look at whatever they like. That's the point of an independent inquiry, is that these three people who have served, Robin Kruk has served governments of all persuasions for a long period of time. She has a lifetime career in the public service. I can't think of anyone better to chair this inquiry. Professor Bennett would be known to people who followed the pandemic, and Dr Jackson is an outstanding health economist who's well credentialed to do this.
You've got the 20 inquiries before you, previous to this. Is there anything then in terms of reference to outside the scope that's already been covered, anything novel in them?
It's a practical way. We've taken the advice of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet that consulted with other departments, including, of course, the Health Department. We have published the terms of reference, but the independent inquiry can look at the full gamut of issues. That's the point of having an independent inquiry. You know, we haven't chosen to do a government committee or a party political process. What we've chosen is an independent inquiry to be run by three eminent Australians. And the independent inquiry will be able to run their own show. They will report back within a year, because it's reasonable as well that we have time frames. One of the things that we did do, to point to the Royal Commission on Robodebt, what we didn't do is kick the can down the road with Royal Commissions that were announced under the former government that are still running into another term. I think that accountability means that you announce an inquiry, you then have a report, you then have a response. That's what we did with the Royal Commission into Robodebt. That's what we're doing with this inquiry.
This is migration.
If it is
Sure.
uncovered that some wrong calls were made, does that potentially open the door up to compensation?
Oh, look, I'm not going to preempt an inquiry that we're announcing this morning. What it's about, though, is very much, and I think Australians will want it to be, concentrated on what can we do better in the future? How do we get better preparedness? That's what we need to do here, because I, like other Australians, there wouldn't be too many Australians who would put their hand up and say, we saw what was coming in 2020. I'm sure there are some people in this building who could put their hand up and say that, because they're health experts and scientists. But I think that it was a difficult period for the entire world to go through. And one of the things, obviously, that the inquiry can look at, if they so seek to, is comparative issues of how things operated in different countries. But overwhelmingly, can I say this? Overwhelmingly, Australians did a remarkable job of getting through what was a very difficult period. And I pay tribute to the essential workers, our nurses, our carers, our childcare workers, people in the aged care sector, our truck drivers who kept food being delivered to supermarkets, our emergency services personnel, all the people who during that pandemic did an extraordinary job during what was a very difficult time. But it was also a time where, in terms of the public service, did a remarkable job as well. I think that Scott Morrison did the right thing by convening the National Cabinet. That was a good decision. We did, I believe, the federal government got it right in making an early call on the pandemic. There were a range of things that we did that were very good, but what can be done better in the future is the objective of having an inquiry. That's why you do this. We've been preparing for this announcement for some time, and we've got it right.
Prime Minister, if we move on to migration and
Sure.
the visa shape-up, this is groups are concerned the 120 to 150k threshold is too much to pay, and what it brought down to 98k. What do you say to that?
I'm sure that that a lot of people would like different changes. I think we're getting it right. We need to deal with skill shortages in the economy. One of the ways that we're dealing with that is in skilled migration. But in addition to that, we have done 180,000 fee-free TAFE places that we announced to be delivered this year. Another example of a promise that we're delivering. But in this case, we're more than delivering, because there's upwards of 220,000 places have been filled. And in Newcastle on Tuesday, I met a young machinist, a fitter and turner at the barley manufacturing sector there in Carrington, who are getting their apprenticeships started in areas of skill shortage. The first female apprentice that's been employed at that facility that's been around for 4 generations, a part family-owned company that's been around for 100 years there. So we're dealing with the skills issues in a way that is appropriate, working with business, as well as making sure that Australians, whether it be their first job or another worker that I met there, becoming a fitter and turner, is an older worker who's retraining, because we know that the labour market does change, but we know in areas like that they're going to grow into the future, and that's why we've created as well Jobs and Skills Australia that will advise and make sure that we don't find ourselves in the circumstance of having skill shortages for year after year after year without action being taken, that we look at what are the jobs that will be needed in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, how do we prepare for that, how do we work with universities and TAFE. We know the big growth sectors will be in the care sector and also in areas of the traditional trades, and we're dealing with both.
Sam Newman in a podcast has urged British citizens, the finals, to boo the welcome to country, saying that Australians are sick of it. What's your response?
I'm not inclined to give Sam Newman any additional publicity, which I'm sure is the objective. Australians are respectful, and the activity that occurs is enhanced. It didn't occur when I was first going to the footy or going to other activities. Showing respect costs nothing. It enriches all of us. Hang on.
Peter Dutton has called for a second referendum. Should this one fail in 2014?
Well, I find Peter Dutton's response quite extraordinary. He has called for a second referendum, then a few days later said no one wanted a second referendum, and then this week has reinforced that he does want a second referendum. We have an opportunity to move forward on October 14. This is an issue where there has been bipartisanship for a long period of time. John Howard went to the 2007 elections saying there should be a referendum on constitutional recognition, saying it was unfinished business in our constitution, and indeed it is. Australians have an opportunity to do the fair thing on October 14. I think Australians are fair. It is fair that we recognise our history didn't begin in 1770 or 1788 or indeed 1901. It goes back some 65,000 years. That should be, and I believe is overwhelmingly, a source of great national pride that we share this continent with the oldest continuous culture on earth. What people are being asked to do is to vote yes to that recognition and yes to an advisory committee that will have just the power of its ideas. A gracious request from Indigenous Australians, and I sincerely hope that Australians vote yes on October 14.
Just on Qantas, they haven't offered international flights out of Adelaide for a decade or so. Is this something you would expect from the national carrier?
Yeah, I think they should, absolutely. And one of the reasons why you have the Gateway Airport issue that's been in place for a long period of time that applies to Sydney, Melbourne, Perth and Brisbane is so that airlines do fly into and out of Adelaide and the smaller markets, Hobart, Gold Coast, other regional airports as well, including Newcastle and Canberra. And that's one of the reasons why you have that policy in place. And I think that I certainly would want to see Qantas fly out of and into Adelaide. I think the national airline should.
Regarding your visit to Whyalla on Monday, can you give us any more of the itinerary?
I've given you a nice little taste there. Well, the Cabinet will take place here in Adelaide, but I'll also be visiting Whyalla in the morning, and it will be a good thing. One of the things that I've made sure as Prime Minister is that I don't just visit the capital cities. So I've been to the Riverland with Peter Malinauskas. I've been keen to visit Whyalla. I've been to Albany, Kalgoorlie, Port Hedland and Karratha in WA. On Tuesday I was in Devonport. Yesterday, seems like a long time ago, I was in Newcastle. I want to be the Prime Minister for the whole country, and regional South Australia is very important, and I've been talking with Mally about a visit there, and so I'll be doing that on Monday, as well as being here in Adelaide on Monday afternoon, and I'll be here in Adelaide on Tuesday as well.
Is the focus of the Whyalla trip the hydrogen plan?
You'll have to wait and see. You've got a story today. I'm giving you notice that one of the things my government is doing is I see other, the coalition went into Parliament for the last fortnight and asked almost every question about the voice, some of which they know the answers to because some of them were just designed to promote confusion. Didn't ask anything of the Treasurer about cost of living. We had national accounts last week. We have now an unemployment figure released last week, of course, with a 3 in front of it once again. There have been 18 times that unemployment has had a 3 in front of it since records began. 15 of them have been on my government's watch. We've created over 500,000 new jobs since we were in government have been created. We're getting on with the increased payments that were done yesterday. We're getting on with new industries, including the exciting prospects that South Australian has in green hydrogen. And I've been meeting with Premier Malinauskas and industry about that as well.